The stemmed glass hovered at the edge of the woman's fingers like a question. For a fraction of a second it caught the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows, a small, bright world tilted and refracted. Then the glass found its arc, and a ribbon of red slid toward the linen. Julia felt the motion before anyone registered it, an old reflex from serving dozens of tables, the polite step, the small apology, the hand that steadies. She reached out to cradle the glass, to nudge it back to safety. The patron's hand jerked away, and the word that followed landed with the force of the fall itself. "Don't touch my things," the woman said. Her voice was cool as marble and twice as polished. She spoke to the room and to the man at the table who wore an expensive watch and a tie that could have paid for the evening. She spoke especially to Julia, a young server in a crisp black apron, the hem of her shirt still smelling faintly of garlic and hot oil. For a heartbeat, the dining room stilled. Cutlery paused in midair like tiny arrested comets. The panoramic view of the city beyond the glass, endless windows and a horizon that had swallowed a dozen skylines, stared back, indifferent. Augusto, the manager, moved before Julia could. He crossed with the practiced gait of someone whose life was made of small, urgent extinguishments. "Ma'am, we'll take care of it," he said, too smooth, voice already arranged in the shape of concession. Beatrice, the woman whose name would later crop up in search bars and gossip columns, smiled a smile that had cost a private stylist. It carried an edge. "Yes, take care of it," the last word like a cudgel. "And the server, her, I don't want to be touched by someone like that." Julia felt the whole room tilt. The phrasing was ancient and cheap, loaded with an ancestry of dismissal. Her palms went clammy against the tray she held. A small wetness darkened the linen at the edge of a napkin. No one at the table shifted to help. No one at the table even looked ashamed. Augusto's jaw tightened. He kept his voice low, the one he used in staff rooms and with vendors, pleading for balance sheets, for calm. "Julia, please step outside." Humiliation is a precise thing. It compacts time and stretches it at once, as if the bones themselves are being rearranged under the skin. The corridor to the service door smelled of bleach and espresso. The wall clock kept precise and wicked time. Julia's steps were small and measured. Her cheeks were hot. She'd been a server for 3 years at this restaurant, which sat like a jewel on the 42nd floor of a downtown block of glass and steel. She had worked the rushes, learned to read customers' moods the way other people read a face. She had worked because she wanted to belong, to learn the business that owned the skyline outside the windows, to prove that she could do more than inherit a name. She stood at the doorway because she had been told to stand.
But she had learned, in kitchens and back alleys of industry, that standing could be active. "She's right," Augusta said, voice careful. "It reflects poorly on the house. We can't have a server who spilled wine," Julia interrupted. The word a small, controlled thing. "What spilled was a drop. If you look at the bill, ma'am, you'll see the service was fine." His face betrayed the strain of a man squeezed between a contract and a complaint. "I have to ask you to leave for the evening," he said, each syllable a small concession, "until we sort this out." The corridor's fluorescent light seemed to sharpen everything, every bead of sweat, every tremor of her hand. The apron that had carried her through shifts now hung on her like an accusation. Customers murmured through the door, a sift of voices that would later condense into versions of the story. Someone at a nearby table clicked a photo. The sound was small and bright and recorded. Julia put down the tray on the service counter and let her fingers linger on the edge of the stainless steel. Her palm left a faint print. Then she pushed the tray away and walked to the small staff locker room, where a metal bench sat like a bench of waiting. Her apron smelled like the service, olive oil and citrus, sweat and cleaning solution. She pulled it off slowly, slowly enough to measure each second. In the locker room, the hum of the HVAC was a low, impartial companion. She sat and stared at the crease of the apron, at the small stain from the tiny spatter of wine that had started everything. A laugh, thin and unsteady, slipped out of her mouth. Her hands found her phone and dialed a number she had almost never used at work. Ernesto answered on the second ring, voice careful and professional. "Julia, what's wrong?" The word wrong folded into an entire landscape. She told him what had happened, and the more she described it, the way the woman's eyes had narrowed, the look of the table, the manager's quick, embarrassed nod, the clearer something inside her became. It wasn't just about the wine. It was about a ledger of moments that had an odor, a pattern, explaining away complaints about staff, taking the client's side as sacred, firing first and asking questions later, because the relationship with clients kept the kitchen humming and the investors patient. Ernesto's voice softened. "First," he said, "you don't do anything reactionary. We document. You save everything. Do you have witnesses? Any video?" Julia thought of the camera tucked unobtrusively in the corner of the dining room, a black dot in a plaster Doric. "I don't know.
Augusto controls it. He wouldn't look at it. Okay, there was a pause on the line. I'll be here. I'll help. But you need to be careful. This cafeteria of public opinion eats the particulars and leaves headlines. She laughed then, sharp and sharp. This isn't about headlines. It's about not being treated like trash. Understood, Ernesto said.
We'll talk to Sebastian if necessary. But don't bring him in unless you need to, she said, the words hurried. I didn't take this job for my name. I'm not... A memory uncoiled, small and luminous. A hand, large and calloused in its way, opening the door to a modest house they had rented years ago, a younger Julia stepping across the threshold. Sebastian, with a patience that felt like a policy, had taught her how to bake bread, how to balance numbers, how to sit at a boardroom table and listen without pretending to be something she wasn't. He had insisted she work, insisted she understand the lives that powered his restaurants. You don't get your place by staying above the work, he told her once on a night when the city was glass and quiet. You get it by knowing what the work costs. She had chosen service with open eyes, both for belonging and for truth, and had worked weekends, late nights, and holidays. She carried the apron not as a badge of humiliation, but as an emblem of a choice. Tonight, the apron felt like a trap. Stay with this, Ernesto said. Get the names of everyone who heard it. Tell Carla, if you trust her. We'll move carefully. Carla's voice was a low, steady thing when she found Julia in the back. The veteran server had the kind of face that tells you it has weathered long shifts and worse. Her hair was pulled back into a bun the color of espresso. They treat us like we're replaceable, she said without preamble, as if they had been sharing a secret for years. But sometimes luck runs out for the others and lands on someone with a name. Julia's jaw tightened. I don't want my name to be the shield. Carla's eyes were kind. Names only help if you use them right. You tell me what you want. After the call with Ernesto and the whispered exchange with Carla, the first block of the night closed like a book whose pages had been read too quickly. The dining room slowed as dessert plates came and went, the sound of city traffic rising below them like rainfall. But the words had been said. The shape of the story was settling into its grooves. If you've ever witnessed injustice at work, stay to see how one person can change a system. The second day began with an aftertaste. Julia had not intended the matter to become spectacle, but the restaurant sat in a district where reputations moved like currents. A patron's complaint could become a ripple could become a headline. She arrived an hour before service, apron folded into a square in her bag like an old promise. She wanted to watch, to see how the house moved now that the evening's complaint had been stored in its memory. Augusto met her by the back door, eyes shifty. There was guilt in the set of his shoulders, and beneath it, the constant accounting of margins and reservations. We had a call this morning, he said without preamble. Corporate. You fired me, she said. She watched him carefully, cataloging how words moved across his face.
He looked pained. Temporary suspension until we review the cameras. It's protocol. She had a half-formed retort, the one that would stitch the humiliation into chords of anger. But when the restaurant's head host crossed through the corridor whispering, a voice carried from the floor, "Is that Julia? Julia Alencar?" At that name, at the surname that matched the man who owned the cluster of restaurants and the glass tower, something in the room slowed again. Julia felt it like a physical pressure. She had always used the name sparsely in these kitchens. Sebastian Alencar paid the payroll, sat on the boards, signed contracts that kept the lights on. But Julia had never wanted the extra distance a prominent name could make. "Yes," Augusta said too quickly. She works here." The host faltered, murmurs blossomed. A couple of diners paused and turned their heads. A young man by the window raised his phone and pretended to check a message. Julia made a decision that was not theatrical but practical. She stepped out into the dining room. The glass behind the tables held the city like a painting, and daylight glinted off the polished surfaces. She walked toward the manager's station with the surety of someone walking along a thin wire who had practiced the balance. "Augusto," she said. Her voice sounded even to her own ear. "I want to see the footage of last night, for the record, and I want an explanation as to why I was suspended without review." He swallowed. "Protocol. We had to satisfy the guest's request. You understand?" "I understand that a guest's request is not a termination order," she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The people at the tables were watching the small field of drama unfurl. Some leaned forward like a hawk. Others quietly made the sign of purchase. Someone always loved drama if it came packaged with a view.
It was an incident, Augusta hedged. The guest can refuse service. Our priority is the house. And what about our priority, our staff? A voice said from the back. Carla had come out, shoulders squared. The kitchen door stood open behind her, heat and steam lending her presence a kind of pressure. We deserve the same priority, Augusto. Augusta glanced at Carla, then at the diners, then at Julia. I'll call corporate. We'll review the cameras. For now, the suspension holds until... Until what? Julia asked. Until the client forgets? Until their influence costs us a life? His face flushed. I can't. I'm trying to keep the business afloat. People cancel, contracts. She could see the ledger in his eyes. It wasn't personal. It never was. It was balance sheets and reservations and the humdrum terror of managers who feared one negative review could sink a month. But she had watched that ledger do damage before. She had learned from Sebastian that the numbers were not neutral. They carried consequences that landed on people.
If you're worried about contracts, she said, call the client back and ask them to sign a statement confirming their complaint. If they refuse, we'll proceed accordingly. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then someone at a corner table made a small, sharp sound of amusement. Is she threatening to sue us? The man asked under his breath. It was the wrong word, in the wrong tone. Julia kept her face composed. I am asking for fairness, she said. I'm asking you to look at the footage before you decide to remove someone's livelihood. He closed his mouth. He nodded. I'll review it. It was an Eden of victories, not yet triumph, but not yet surrender. She had bought time. She had shifted the mechanics of a system that often preferred to close its eyes. That afternoon, a call from Ernesto came with the gravity of counsel. You did well at the floor, he said, but be careful about walking into traps. I can request formal access to the cameras, but it will take time. Time, she repeated. Time was the small tyrant that favored the powerful. While she waited, Beatrice's complaint ricocheted. She was not a private citizen with private whims. She had reach. Beatrice owned a foundation that donated to museum wings, and the patrons in the room were the types who wrote checks that bent to public opinion. Her name mattered to headlines for the same reason Sebastian's name did. The social currency they both possessed could tilt a city's conversation. Newsrooms are always looking for angles, so are influencers with their phones and their hungry audiences. By late afternoon, a clip of the exchange, someone at a table had filmed it, as they always did, began to circulate. It circulated with commentary and with the kind of certainty that made things feel inevitable. Rich kid fired, read one caption. Entitled server thrown out, read another. Each frame offered a different lead. Julia watched from the small office in the back where staff gathered to fold napkins and listen to the city breathe. The clip was not complete. It did not capture the delicate portion of the night where she had steadied the glass, the part that to her held the truth. But it held enough to make a story. In the absence of context, confirmation came from the loudest voice. This is going to be messy, Carla said, not unkindly. You sure you want to keep your name on this? She did. People often assumed that being an adopted daughter of a billionaire meant doors were always open and consequences always softened. The truth was more complicated. Sebastian's influence was real, but being his child had wrapped her in questions of identity that were hard to answer for herself. She worked to feel that she had earned a place at the family's table, not merely received it. Working the floor had been her chosen path, part humility, part study. Memory again, a fragment of a different life. A smaller kitchen, dough under fingernails, Sebastian instructing her with impatient tenderness.
You can learn what a person is by how they do the little things, he'd said. Respect is not bestowed by a name, it's earned by action. He had insisted she infiltrated the world that built his empire, the kitchens, the floors, so that she wouldn't be a passenger in decisions that shaped hundreds of livelihoods. She folded the chiffon napkin in her hands and felt the edge of an old vow. By evening, even the city's more frivolous feeds had caught wind. Guests whispered. Some left early. Others remained, moved instead by the spectacle, their phones alight. A food blogger who had been scheduled to dine that night posted a short, biting tweet. Who does the house choose? Guest comfort or worker dignity? Tonight's dinner tastes like a decision. It was the kind of half-moral, half-snark that could influence a reservations manager's dreams. Augusto called her into the manager's office under the pretense of apology. He seemed younger now, hollowed by the knowledge that one client's dissatisfaction could scale into corporate anxiety. He read to her a statement, practically written by a PR person whose job it was to pair blame and serve calm. He said the word regret several times. He said protocol and client satisfaction, as if the words could be talismans. What he did not say was what mattered, whether he had watched the footage. The omission throbbed.
"Have you seen the clip?" Julia asked. He nodded. "I saw something. It's messy." But the client insisted. "Clients don't get to fire people arbitrarily," she said. "Not from me, not with no review." "It isn't just from you," he pleaded. "It affects the house. They threaten to take their business, withdraw a booking next month. That affects salary. It affects my job." She listened. She did not hate him. She hated the shape of the system that forced such choices. She also did not want to be someone whose presence in a building made money shy away. She wanted a resolution that preserved livelihoods and restored dignity. That required clarity. She took a breath. "Augusto, if you won't review the cameras, then I'll escalate." He shook his head. If I go to corporate, she said, each word deliberate, "I'll ask for an impartial review. If you have nothing to hide, you'll support a review." He looked as if he wanted to protest. He looked as if he feared a new kind of consequence, publicity that would brand him as callous. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll ask corporate, but it won't be quick." They both knew what he meant. Corporate was slow in paperwork and swift in smoothing. It was a bureaucracy with the temperament of a glacier and the appetite of a hurricane. That night, Julia went home to the modest apartment she continued to rent despite the option to take a larger place with Sebastian. Ownership made other people nervous. She clung to the ordinary. She made tea and answered emails from friends. Her phone buzzed with messages, some supportive, some snide.
A headline had already started to form. Rich daughter fired? The question mark was a polite nudge toward outrage. Ernesto called again, professional gentleness compressed into lines of practical counsel. "We can request footage and statements," he said. "We can draft a letter to be sent to the restaurant's legal counsel." "Don't make this about my name," Julia said. "If this becomes a spectacle about Sebastian and not about workplace dignity, we lose the point." He was quiet for a beat. "I understand, but we should consider that your name will change the dynamics. People will interpret. They will read leverage where you only want fairness." She knew that leverage existed. She also knew that leverage was neutral, the way currency was neutral. How one spent it declared character. In the small hours she slept, only to wake with the same set of consequences waiting at the top of the day. When she arrived in the morning, a press van idled near the glass building like a foreign animal. The concierge had been given a deposit of outrage and was dispensing it to the cameras that wanted faces and angles. A line formed. Reporters with recorder pens hovered near the sidewalk. Someone unfurled a microphone and asked about dignity as if it were a flavor. At noon, she received a text from an unknown number, a link to a clip. She hadn't seen this one. It was longer, and the framing was sharp, a table's footage from a subscriber inside the dining room, the angle that removed her control and put the complaint on a loop. The loop made the moment into an event. The clip had already been clipped and reclipped and uploaded to a dozen platforms. Then came another text from a number she recognized, Rogerio Tavares, a client of the house, and someone with a reputation for being blunt and decisive in business. "Saw the clip. Unfair. If they don't handle this right, I'm out on the MOU," the message read. In business terms, that was a threat to withdraw funds in future bookings. In smaller letters, it was a kind of solidarity that had begun to feel like currency. She leaned against the stairwell banister and considered the mechanics of pressure. Pressure did not always work in her favor. Sometimes it crushed. Sometimes it bent the world so that the right thing became possible. Augusto, meanwhile, had been pushed into a corner. Corporate finally replied with the gentle force of structure, a formal request for footage and witness statements to be reviewed within 72 hours. The timeline was too slow for a narrative that moved on hot tracks, but it was a step. They were not perhaps as dead as he feared. By late afternoon, the restaurant's PR team sent an internal memo. "Do not speak to press. Take all communications through the chain." A small cluster of employees protested quietly, Carla among them, about being muzzled. The union whispers grew louder in corners. In another world, unions would have been a sure thing.
In this world, they were a rumor that could be true or not, depending on the press. On the edges of this slow-motion storm, Beatriz did not stay still. She called her lawyer, Patricia Fonseca, an appellate shark with a voice that could trim a paragraph into a confession. Patricia's office smelled faintly of leather and citrus. She listened as Beatriz outlined how the patronage of their table had been violated, how a server had invaded their space, and how the hotel, and by connection the restaurant, had allowed it. "Reputation matters," Patricia said. "We will file a formal complaint. If necessary, we will pursue a defamation claim. The video—" "Make it stop," Beatriz said. "I gave them the right to be attentive. They should be grateful." Patricia did not hum. She already had a strategy forming. First, a preemptive narrative in the press that painted Beatriz as the injured party. Second, a legal framing that would compel the restaurant to move quickly for fear of costly litigation. The goal was to leverage public sympathy and legal pressure to force an outcome favorable to their side before anyone had time to see the whole. That night, Julia sat at her small kitchen table and wrote a list. Names: Carla. Witnesses: 2 busboys, a sommelier who had been at the bar. Requests made for footage. She messaged Isabella, a consultant Sebastian had hired in another context for compliance and training, and asked for a meeting. Isabella responded with the swift competence of someone who had navigated crisis management before. Come by tomorrow. I'll help you assemble statements. There was a sharp edge of irony in that. The man who had taught her to learn from the floor, her adoptive father, had already planned to bring in policies that would protect dignity, yet she wanted to prove first that dignity mattered apart from his name. If something in this story was to change the work culture, it had to be rooted in the lives of the people who worked beneath the chandeliers, and not merely in headlines. And still, names had currency. The next morning she decided to use hers, but not as a weapon. She folded her apron into the square in her bag and walked into the restaurant with her head held as if she were simply a woman who belonged somewhere. She walked past the host stand, past tables that still whispered, to the manager's station. The dining room seemed to catch on itself. Forks paused, eyes shifted. When she spoke, it was not a speech. It was a simple statement delivered into a room that had been primed for drama. "My name is Julia Alencar," she said. "I am Sebastian Alencar's adopted daughter. I work here. I want you to look at the footage." The effect was immediate. The sound of a camera shutter, someone's phone, snapped like a wire breaking. A dozen heads turned. She felt the weight of expectation rest on her shoulders. Augusto's face registered a new set of calculations. For a moment, the ledger reopened, and the numbers rearranged themselves.
Patrons whispered. A woman at the bar nudged her companion. Someone who had been waiting for a dinner reservation tapped his foot impatiently. This was not the reveal of a secret identity for melodrama. It was a strategic act born from the desire to shift the conversation. If she allowed the story to be about her name instead of the substance of the incident, the dignity of workers, the standards of the house, then the thing she wanted would be lost in theater. Yet theater would be part of it, whether she liked it or not. A viral clip could become a weapon for justice or a cudgel to beat the weak. The name functioned as pressure. Pressure could be useful if you wanted to pry a hinge open. At the edge of the dining room, a man in a dark suit reached for his phone. He had a Twitter handle known for turning small incidents into trending pieces. He whispered into his device and recorded the moment. Someone else, a news freelancer, pushed through the door with a press pass visible like a talisman. "Ms. Alencar?" a voice called out from the doorway. It was a reporter's tone, curious and just tight enough to be dangerous. "Can you tell us why you're here?" She breathed, measured the room, and answered with the clarity of someone who intended to keep the frame steady. "I'm here because we should look at the footage, because somebody's livelihood shouldn't be decided on a patron's impulse." That night, as the new clip spread, comments piled, some supportive, some suspicious. The narrative was no longer a simple loop. In newspapers and feeds the next morning, the headline possibilities multiplied. "Billionaire's daughter fires back when read," "Server or heiress," another asked, as if the question could be balanced on the tip of a spoon. Julia understood, with the frayed philosophical clarity of someone living in a small apartment and answering to a name that mattered, that the world would choose the easiest angle. If she wanted attention to land on dignity at work rather than the spectacle of privilege, she would have to steer it, to invest her name in something larger than spectacle. By the close of the block, a more dangerous energy entered the orbit. Beatrice's team had filed a notice with legal counsel, and her lawyer, Patricia, had sent a formal letter to the restaurant demanding an apology and a retraction. The implication of formal legal steps shifted the conversation from moral to juridical. It was no longer about the immediate human wrong. It was about the machinery of law and media and leverage. Ernesto called, voice even. "They're moving fast. Patricia is sharp. Be prepared for a defamation claim." He had not said, "You will be sued." He didn't make promises. He didn't make guarantees. He laid out possible procedures, probabilities like stones you could build a wall with or be crushed under. She listened. The idea of being dragged into a courtroom alarmed her.
Yet the alternative, allowing an unexamined lie to calcify into accepted truth, felt worse. She would not let a false narrative harden into a moral precedent that permitted the buying and selling of dignity. Her decision hardened into a plan: gather evidence, secure witness statements, and secure legitimate access to security footage through the proper channels. She asked Isabella to come in and consult about compliance measures and public messaging. Ernesto would prepare the formal requests for footage. Carla would gather statements from staff. She would practice restraint and clarity in interviews. She would lean into the discomfort of her name, not as armor, but as a lever. Still, even her careful moves could not control the next day's wave. The clip of her revealing her name was brief, a 30-second clip on a platform that loved the dramatic and favored the cruel. Beatrice's side posted a follow-up, a statement that painted the moment as an attempt at intimidation, suggesting the patron had been harassed by someone wielding influence. The frame had changed again.
Patricia pushed for an immediate apology under retraction. She hinted at the costs of proceeding otherwise. The next morning, a white envelope appeared on Augusto's desk, a formal demand. The restaurant's PR lit up. Corporate sent a terse bulletin. Do not engage with the press. Send all communication down to legal. Julia sat with the team in a private room where someone had formerly used the table to balance wine tastings and strategy. The small group was a cross-section: Ernesto with his tidy legal certainty, Isabella with flowcharts and compliance checklists, Carla with quiet fury, and Julia with the rawness of someone whose choices had set a narrative machine in motion. We are not here to weaponize your name, Ernesto said, but your identity changes institutional calculus. People will listen in ways they might not otherwise. That creates opportunity and risk. Isabella spread out a set of steps, a map for the next 72 hours. We request footage formally, she said. We gather statements. We prepare a measured public response to be delivered through a controlled channel. You don't want to be reactive on social media. You want to set a tone. Carla's impatience was visible. She's already being painted as the aggressor by clients. We need to be honest, loud. She was humiliated. Honest and loud can be different things, Isabella said. Honest is evidence. Loud is something else. We'll need to marry the two. Evidence presented in a manner that the public can trust. The room quieted as it applied the principle of patience to an incident that felt like an emergency. There were logistical steps: request to security, witness statements, a schedule for a press release, mapping of legal options, and a media floor plan in case of protests.
By the time the sun slid into the western window, casting a long, sanguine light across the table, the team had a plan that felt like an armature: procedural, methodical, slow enough to avoid traps, hopeful enough to set a course. Julia lay awake that night, counting the measures she'd taken like beads, feeling the tremor of possibility. She understood that the story had not reached its peak. She also understood that the next movement would be louder, and the stakes would be higher. The name she bore would offer leverage and invite scrutiny. The path of justice would be procedural and messy, and she would make mistakes. But the thought that had first hardened in the locker room, someone's livelihood should not be determined by the flick of a wrist or the whim of the powerful, remained like a heartbeat under her ribs. Across the city, in a study lined by leather books and the residue of power, Sebastian read a press briefing with the look of a man who watches the systems he has built ripple. His daughter's name had arrived at his inbox as a headline and a moral problem. He was not a man accustomed to being outside the machines he had designed. He called Ernesto, and then he called his assistant, and then he summoned his counsel. He arranged for Isabella's consulting fees to be covered. He did not call his daughter that night. He waited instead to gather facts, to understand, unwilling to make a move that might, in his absence, compromise the very thing he had tried to teach her: humility in power. In the quiet between decisions, Julia slept, and in the dawn she rose to face the consequences that public stories always bring: misinterpretations, threats, sympathy, and the complicated calculus of leverage used well or badly. When she stepped back onto the service floor the following day, the tenseness of the week had accumulated into something palpable. The cameras were still there, reporters were not absent, but a different thing had started as well. Colleagues who had watched the clip had begun to speak to each other in the way people do when they decide they will not let a single instance stand for a pattern. Carla had been contacted by a former employee from a sister restaurant with a tale of a patron who had been forgiven for worse. Someone else had a text from a contractor who had seen a pattern in corporate contracts that favored patrons over staff. The story had shifted from a single drop of wine to a broader map of behavior. At midday, a delivery van pulled up and a man stepped out, a middle-aged figure with an open face. Rogerio Tavares, whose text had hinted at a potential withdrawal of contracts, had arrived in person. He walked past the host stand and into the kitchen, stopping to speak with chefs, servers, and kitchen hands. He listened more than he spoke. When he met Julia, he extended a hand. "You don't make this about you, do you?" he said, half a smile. "You want fairness." She took his hand. "Yes," she said, "that's all." He nodded. Outside, the city continued with its daily respirations: cars honking, elevators sighing, the distant complaint of a siren. Inside, a quiet constellation of decisions was forming. Insist on evidence, insist on fairness, not on vengeance. The machinery of law and press and corporate would move. Somewhere down the line, confrontation would come. But for now, a coalition was forming: servers with memories and receipts, a legal counsel with an even temper, and a daughter who had chosen to learn at the floor. When the evening press arrived at the doors for a follow-up, voices multiplied like a weather pattern. Questions came, cameras rolled. The restaurant looked like a stage, the city like an audience.
Somewhere in the press cacophony, Beatrice's attorney sent a last-minute note, a strongly worded public demand. It was a challenge and a test of resolve. Julia braced herself for a long haul. She had no illusions about the shape of the fight. It could hurt reputations. It could hurt livelihoods. It might, in the end, force institutions to change or pall beneath the pressure of money and silence swallow the truth. The next days were a calculus of procedure and pressure. Corporate replied with the kind of bureaucratic punctuality that both comforts and infuriates. Formal requests for footage and witness statements, deadlines stamped with polite urgency. Ernesto filed a preservation notice, an ordinary legal step that halted the erasure of any security footage or logs. Isabella set up interviews and began to map the fractures in the restaurant's informal contract with its patrons. Who could bend rules, who paid for the privilege of amnesty, and how often managers had preferred customer comfort over staff dignity. They worked like people building scaffolding around a fragile structure. The footage request went through the proper channels. The timing, Isabella explained, mattered. It shows we're not trying to step-side anything, she told Julia. We're following rules. That matters in the court of law and in the court of public opinion. The footage arrived on a secure drive 3 days later. Corporate's camera system, time-stamped and clear. It showed the whole arc of the night. It showed the glass tilt. It showed Julia's hand steadying it. It showed Beatrice's face, the deliberate recoil, the words. It showed how the manager moved first toward the patron, not toward calm resolution. It was small, procedural truth, recorded in pixels and timecode. Watching the footage with Ernesto, Isabella, and Carla, Julia felt the quietness of a room holding its breath. They marked timestamps, who had been present, the angle of a phone camera that had become the looped clip, a snippet of a table conversation that later commentators would cut into 1,000 meanings.
They compiled statements from staff, Carla's precise recollection, a busboy's account of how he had seen the guest lean forward, a sommelier's note that the wine had been steady until someone's hand nudged it. Each statement was an iteration of the night that pulled at the thread of what had been spun into a caricature. Patricia Fonseca, for Beatrice, did not idle. She sent letters that read like small storms, demands, threats, the language of exposure. Her firm flooded certain reporters with claims that their client had been wronged, that the wealthy daughter had attempted intimidation. A smear piece found a home in a site that trafficked in outrage. Anonymous messages reached servers who had prepared statements, soft menaces to not talk, hinting at lawsuits and ruined careers. One server, younger and frightened, removed her name from the list of witnesses after an anonymous call in the night. It altered the pattern of the investigation enough to make the team wary. Pressure could still break resolve. Rogerio's presence was steady rather than theatrical. He came by the restaurant with nothing but time and a careful appetite for facts. He spoke to line cooks, to the dishwasher who had worked nights, and had a voice that carried truth without ornament. He listened to stories of a late patron forgiven for smashing plates, of a celebratory table excused for overstepping boundaries. "This isn't an isolated problem," he said to Julia in the kitchen, where the heat made everything intimate. "It's a pattern. If you can show pattern, you change the frame. People stop seeing this as a private problem and start seeing it as a system one. But showing a pattern is not the same as proving malice. A legal claim of defamation requires a careful balance of fact and inference. A public campaign needs crisp, credible facts. That is where Sebastian's quiet influence, not as blunt force, but as access to internal records, became decisive. He requested an internal audit of complaints over time. The audit found multiple formal complaints and a handful of memos from regional managers suggesting preferred patron accommodations. There was a series of notes, mundane, bureaucratic, where managers had prioritized guest satisfaction over staff grievances to protect bookings. None of it was explosive by itself, but in aggregate outlined a culture that let power insulate itself from accountability. Julia sat with the audit open on a laptop, her reflection in the dark screen layered like a ghost over the rows of entries. She felt the old tug of contradiction. Here was leverage she could use to crush the person who'd humiliated her, and here was the opportunity to build safeguards that would prevent that humiliation from falling on someone else. The temptation to make Beatrice an object lesson was real. So was the knowledge that humiliation meted by one person would not end with her. "You can ruin her," Ernesto said to her once. The plainness of his sentence both a warning and an observation. You can file counterclaims, seek damages. You can make her name infamous. But success there doesn't create the structures you're asking for. It could make people fear being wronged into silence. In the quiet of Sebastian's office, books, a globe, the slow hum of the city, Julia asked him the question she had been avoiding. How much of the family's power should she bear? Sebastian looked at her as if measuring the weight of a plate. Power used to punish is easy, he said finally. Power used to repair is harder. It requires institutions, people who will keep doing right when you are not in the room. She thought about the apron, about the feel of linen at her shoulder, and of fingerprints at the edge of a steel tray. She thought of the servers who had withdrawn their statements, of the quiet calls of pressure. "If I take her down," she said, "what changes? The managers still make the choice." "Then change the managers' incentives," he said. "Change the reporting. Fund training that isn't a brochure. Build a system where dignity has teeth." It was not the answer she had wanted to hear. She had wanted a neat retribution, an arc that ended in immediate vindication. Instead, she received a plan. That was the thing about inherited influence. Its truest moral test was whether you would use it to settle scores or to change conditions. The confrontation that followed was public, staged by the realities of a story that had outgrown any single user. A day was set for a press appearance outside the restaurant, controlled, managed, a place where evidence could be presented, and Beatrice's response could be noted on record. Patricia tried to delay with procedural letters. Ernesto replied with legal formalities and an offer of mediation. The press arrived in numbers. Cameras, lights, recorders flashing like insects. The restaurant's front stairs held a small amphitheater. Julia stood at the top of the steps with Carla at her side and Rogerio a step back. Sebastian arrived not as a man to dominate the narrative, but as a steward, measured, careful, his presence an insurance that things would be examined. Beatrice came with Patricia in a crisp suit, and a publicist who translated indignation into camera-slick soundbites. The air smelled of asphalt and camera perfume. Ernesto did the opening, a factual statement about the incident, the steps taken to request and preserve footage, and the legal process they had initiated to protect staff rights. He spoke in plain sentences, naming timestamps and procedures. Isabella then presented their findings in a crisp, non-spectacular way. The footage, the internal audit showing a pattern of complaints and managerial memos that treated preferred patron accommodations as part of a business model, and sworn statements from staff that corroborated elements of the night.
The presentation was not a public shaming. It was a meticulous laying of evidence on a table. Patricia rose to object at several points. "This is selective," she said, sliding into the rhythm of an adversary who had practiced in public. "This is narrative selection." She gestured toward the press, toward the cameras, to suggest theater over truth. Her face was a practiced mask. Then a wrinkle appeared that even Patricia had not quite expected. A former manager from another city branch, whose resignation had been settled quietly months before, sent a letter to Julia's counsel. It described a pattern: guests who had been allowed to behave without consequence because they were large donors to events, patrons who had been excused from policy, servers who had been sidelined. The former manager included copies of emails, managerial chain, where accommodations had been explicitly discussed. None of these communications constituted criminality. They were company emails, a record of choices. But they provided context, a repeated practice that privileged patrons had been allowed latitude at staff expense. When the letter was read aloud, there was a perceptible shift in the crowd. The story was no longer a single clash. It had the architecture of a systemic failing. Reporters murmured. Beatrice's publicist looked awkward. Patricia's mouth tightened into a line. On the sidewalk, a single camera circled. Beatrice was asked directly whether she would apologize if the internal record showed that the kitchen and the house had failed to protect their staff. For a long moment, she did not answer. The silence was a force. She had been practiced at being wronged. She had never been asked to be the one to apologize publicly. Patricia whispered, then urged caution. "My client will not be dictated to by threats," she said finally. "We will consider the facts." But the facts had a momentum of their own. Rogerio stepped forward. His MOU withdrawal threat, now public, had real teeth for the restaurant chain. He spoke plainly of standards and reputation, of business that could not be risked on the whim of unrestrained patrons. A few other clients, contacted quietly over the morning, expressed discomfort with being associated with a place that appeared to condone humiliation. Business leverage, when aligned with moral clarity, became an amplifier. Beatrice looked out at the crowd, at cameras that had expected a spectacle, but instead found a ledger of evidence and a chorus of voices asking for repair. Her face softened, not because she had spontaneously felt contrition, but because the world she inhabited misread retreat as a loss and apology as a transaction. Her personal publicist hissed. Her lawyer advised against an immediate apology. Julia felt the old hunger to make Beatrice suffer subside into something quieter. She thought of the dishwasher who had told Rogerio about being consistently overlooked for promotions.
She thought of Carla, of the server who had been too frightened to sign a statement. She thought about what would remain after Beatrice's name was dragged through the press. Revenge would not build a hotline, nor train managers in conflict de-escalation. Revenge would not provide anonymous complaint channels or a third-party ombudsman. "Public apology," someone shouted from a camera. It landed like a live wire. Beatrice opened her mouth, and the apology that came out was shaky, political, then partial, then steadier. "I am sorry that Miss Alencar felt humiliated," she said. "It was not my intention. If my actions were perceived as harmful, I regret that. I hope the restaurant will review its policies and ensure that all staff are treated with respect." It was not all the words the assembled crowd might have wanted. Patricia later explained that the apology was a strategic move to avoid further escalation. On paper, it functioned. Beatrice's team filed a statement withdrawing their immediate threat to pursue litigation while reserving rights, a legal formulation that maintained options without immediacy. Publicly, the headline read, "Patron apologizes, lawsuit put on hold." For many who had watched, it was a small victory. But for Julia, it felt conditional. Useful, yes, but incomplete. The quiet victory had opened a new front, not an individual reckoning, but institutional reform. She stood with Ernesto and Sebastian and proposed it, a comprehensive program to protect dignity at work across the chain. It would include an anonymous reporting line, mandatory de-escalation and dignity training for managers and front of house, a third-party ombudsman, and a transparent mechanism to review patron complaints against staff. It would require investment, not symbolic gestures but money for training, time for oversight, and a commitment to enforce consequences. Some executives balked. There were costs beyond dollars, reputational risks, fears of false claims, the difficulty of changing a system that had for years privileged high-spending guests. But the pressure from clients, Rogerio among them, and the public momentum made the business case. Sebastian pledged resources and insisted on independence. An external firm would design and audit the program. The commitment felt like a hinge in the place between the world Julia had chosen to belong to and the world she wanted to shape. In the weeks that followed, the chain of events read like a study in slow repair. The restaurant implemented Dignity at Work, a program that was more than a phrase on a website. Workshops were held in the staff room after hours with an outside facilitator who talked about power dynamics, complaints procedures, and respectful conflict resolution. Managers underwent training that required them to document the steps they took to resolve patron-staff conflicts. An anonymous reporting line was installed and publicized to staff.
An ombudsman's office, staffed externally, began taking calls, promising confidentiality and an impartial review. Not every change was immediate, nor did every heart change overnight. A few patrons grumbled about the new strictures. A small group of high-spending clients paused their bookings to watch what would happen. Several employees who had been hesitant to speak felt safer and came forward with stories that humanized the need for reform. A barista who had endured sarcasm from a regular, a line cook who'd been denied overtime pay in favor of smoothing over a client's complaint. Each story added texture to the abstract talk of culture. Beatrice's public path diverged from Julia's. She chose to keep her public life measured. She issued a fuller apology weeks later and attended, at Julia's invitation, a private session on staff dignity as part of a corporate outreach. The cameras were not present. This was not theater. In a room that smelled of coffee and new notepads, she listened. Her defenses, honed over decades of being seen as a wronged party, softened in the face of details. The waiter whose mother had sick leave and was scared of being fired. The hostess who juggled 2 jobs. For a short time, at least, she saw the consequences of her recoil not as an act of personal preference, but as a move that landed on other people. Redemption does not arrive like sudden absolution. In private, Beatrice wrote a letter apologizing to Julia and to the staff. In public, she endorsed the Dignity program as an important step and agreed to fund a scholarship for hospitality workers seeking managerial training. The funding was a pragmatic reconciliation. It acknowledged harm and redirected resources to structural support. Whether Beatrice had changed at heart was for other people to judge. For Julia, the important thing was that the outcomes, training, reporting mechanisms, independent review, materialized. The legal clouds thinned without a courtroom drama. Patricia prepared for litigation but accepted the mediated settlement, reserving potential claims but retracting immediate threats. The restaurant removed the temporary suspension from its internal records. Some managers were reassigned. One was dismissed after an internal review found negligence in enforcing policy. The firm's public communications emphasized the new program. A press release quoted Sebastian on the importance of dignity and Julia on the responsibility of leadership to protect workers. The headlines favored institutional change over individual scandal. The months after were not an easy moral windfall. There were setbacks. A tastemaker wrote a piece accusing Julia of spectacle, a smear that circulated among certain circles. And there were days when staff still reported discomfort.
But measures and metrics began to map an improvement. Anonymous staff surveys showed an increase in the number of people who felt comfortable reporting incidents. Turnover began to dip in certain branches.
Training sessions filled. The ombudsman reported a rise in initial complaints, people finally feeling safe enough to speak, and a steady rate of resolution with clearer documentation. Julia found herself in meeting rooms she had once watched from the floor. She listened more than she spoke at first, learning how budgets moved, how policy required more than will. She argued for the human detail, enough time for staff to attend trainings without losing dinner shifts, compensation for workers attending mandatory sessions, and a reinvigoration of internal promotion practices that favored performance, not patron favor. She insisted that every policy have a test. What would happen if a top client violated it? Would the company hold? Would a manager lose a bonus? If not, policy would be theater. Carla, patient and steady, became part of the implementation team, promoted to a senior supervisory role that she had earned through years of careful work when others had chosen performance for patrons over people. She led a workshop on bystander intervention. At a ceremony at the restaurant, Sebastian presented Carla with a small plaque. The gesture was private and public at once, and the staff applauded like a family that had earned a home. There were ripple effects beyond the chain. A conference call with several restaurant groups resulted in a coalition, a voluntary code of conduct for patrons endorsed by several city restaurateurs. Other companies began asking for the Dignity at Work manual. A regional hospitality association invited Julia to speak about the moral and business case for dignity policies. She was uncomfortable in the spotlight, but clear. This isn't about punishing a person, she told an audience of general managers and owners. It's about protecting the people who make this industry possible. Her speech was tempered, not triumphant. She spoke of the night in the locker room, of the apron, of the choice to work at the floor to understand the cost of things. She spoke of the obligation of power, to use it to repair and to prevent. She spoke of failing managers, of the fear of staff, and of the courage of colleagues who signed statements in the face of pressure. People listened. People took notes. People later adopted elements of the program. Not all relationships healed. Some patrons no longer felt comfortable in the chain. Some never returned. Some managers left, unwilling to adapt. But attrition was not always loss. It was part of the rebalancing. Spaces redefined by a commitment to dignity were not for everyone, and that was an acceptable condition of moral clarity. The epilogue that followed, a year out, was not a fairy tale, but a ledger of incremental progress. Daily operations had normalized. The restaurant's reservations were stable, and the program had become a component of recruitment materials.
Staff retention improved modestly. The ombudsman reported that early complaints had declined as the training and reporting mechanisms matured. Carla told a story at the staff retreat about a young server who had once been too afraid to speak and who now led a table training. Her arc was a small emblem of the program's human impact. Julia's relationship with Sebastian evolved in a quiet way. They had conversations that were not about boardrooms, but about consequence. He still maintained a pragmatic patience, but he had also learned to listen to the people on the floor in different ways, asking for periodic audit reports, for independent oversight, for proof that commitments were not mere PR. He learned to let his daughter lead in certain domains, to trust that her experience on the floor made her voice credible among workers and decisive among executives. Beatrice did not become a different person overnight, but she did show up at a later industry gathering to discuss philanthropy in the sector, and in a short public exchange, reiterated a commitment to supporting hospitality training. Whether it was redemption or damage control, the outcome for many employees was unchanged. The company paid attention and instituted mechanisms to protect them. Julia sat one evening on a small terrace that overlooked the same cityscape she had once seen from the restaurant's glass. In her hands was a folded apron she no longer wore to work, but kept because it reminded her of choices made. The lights of the skyline shimmered. The city had not changed its angle toward power, but a small part of its institutions had shifted. Workers she knew had been promoted. A young hostess had started a night school scholarship funded by the Dignity program. Carla was mentoring new supervisors. Little by little, the ledger of dignity accrued. There were hard lessons. She had learned that power can buy attention, but not always trust. She had learned that retribution could be easy and short-lived, while institutional repair demanded stubbornness and patience. She had also learned to be suspicious of the romance of being wronged. Harsh judgment rarely improved other lives. She had chosen to use her name not as a cudgel, but as a wedge to pry open a system that had allowed humiliation to be cheap. The final image of the year returned to the restaurant, to a quiet moment before service. A glass was set on a table, alone, waiting.
A server, one who had once been too nervous to speak in the locker room, stepped past with steady hands. Julia, watching, saw in those hands not the tremor of the night that had started the change, but the calm of someone who had learned both the cost and the craft of serving. For a second, the city outside, the lights across a dozen buildings, seemed like a map that could be rewritten by persistent people. Her phone buzzed with a note from Rogerio. "We're moving our MOU back to renewals. You did good."
She typed a short reply, 2 words that carried more than etiquette. "We tried." If there remained any ambiguity about the moral of what had unfolded, Julia found the answer in small gestures. An employee who felt safe enough to return to work after a long absence. A manager who once deferred to patrons and now deferred to policy. A patron who, startled by training, apologized to a server in a way that was both clumsy and sincere. Systems change slowly, but they change. The last public act of closure was not legal, but civic. At a small ceremony hosted in the restaurant's back room, with staff and management and a few clients present, Julia announced an annual scholarship for hospitality students and a small endowment to fund continued audits of dignity in company restaurants. She spoke briefly of humility and responsibility, of the apron tucked into her bag and the lessons it held. She thanked Carla, Ernesto, Isabella, Rogerio, and in a measured voice, she thanked Sebastian for trusting her to try. Beatrice sent a note that said simply, "I hope this helps." It was not grand, it was not absolution. For Julia, it was enough as part of a larger mosaic, an admission, a funding stream, attendance at a training, and the sense that, in a small professional ecology, a different standard had been set. Months later, at a conference panel on workplace dignity, Julia sat on a stage across from leaders from different industries. She told one anecdote about the sound of a shattered stem and the choice that followed, choice to work from the floor, to hold people accountable, and to insist that dignity be a non-negotiable line. The audience applauded. Industry publications picked up the narrative. More restaurants began to inquire about adopting similar programs. The movement remained modest, but it was real, a set of practices and standards slowly diffusing through a system that had previously rewarded silence. The story did not end in a courtroom or in the public ruin of anyone. It ended in a long, careful work of repair, a program, some reassignments, an ombudsman, and a modest scholarship. It ended in changed meetings where managers now asked, "How will this impact our staff?" before asking, "How will this impact our guests?" It ended with the knowledge that power could be used to protect, not just to punish. On a quiet morning some months later, standing by the service door, Julia lifted a glass to her hand without thinking. The gesture was instinctive. The glass did not tilt. The memory of the night, the collar of the apron, the cramped staff room, the hum of the HVAC, sat beside her like an old, rigorous teacher. She kept the apron folded in a drawer and wore a small pen from the Dignity program at her jacket lapel. It did not announce her name. It announced a practice. She had been the billionaire's adopted daughter who had been treated like a maid from the very first day in that dining room. She had also chosen to remain near the work.
She had chosen not to let revenge define the arc. Instead, she had built protections that might ease future humiliations for someone else. It was not perfect, it was not final, but it was a beginning, a visible, committed beginning in a world where beginnings were often the only durable thing people could hope to leave behind. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to follow more stories of workplace dignity and the people who choose to change systems, not just headlines.